So getting into this chapter, what an exciting concept to look at this idea of consciousness, right? And remember, when we think about this idea of consciousness, it is just that, it's a concept. Really exciting things about kind of getting into this concept is that we get to kind of explore something that is so intangible yet so present. And that's awesome. That is kind of one of the cool things that we get to really do as scientists. So, consciousness, what is it? How does it work? When does it fail? Right? What defines the edges of our conscious window? Right? So many cool things to explore here. Oftentimes my favorite question to ask when I'm in a class with everyone else is saying, well, what does it mean to be conscious? Like, are we conscious right now? Are we conscious, while we're listening to this lecture? Are we conscious while we're sleeping? Right? And getting to hear that feedback, I think, really shows us a lot. Many psychologists define consciousness as our awareness of ourselves and our environment, right? And this is really interesting because when we look at the ideas of like philosophers of past, like Descartes, he would say something like, I think, therefore I am, right? And I think that consciousness embodies a little bit more, embodies a little bit more of not just our ability to think, but also our spatial awareness, our awareness of things like our body temperature, our awareness of, the environment that is constantly changing. Also, there are a lot of things that can impact our conscious experience. Hunger, thirst, right? When we are feeling hungrier, we seem to think a lot more about food. In fact, they did a really fascinating study in the past when it came to how much something like hunger might impact someone's actual awareness of certain things that may even to most people be subliminal. Right? What subliminal means that things kind of almost happening below the level of our conscious awareness, right? So one psychologist wanted to prove this out, and he actually used college students because they're great guinea pigs. And so part of what he did in this experiment is he actually, in his class, he gave these extra credit assignments, and he said to half the class, what I want you to do for the next 24 hours is to just fast, don't eat anything. And the other half of the class said, okay, look, just eat like you normally do. Eat ad lib, as you want. And then the next day, the next time they had class, when they came in, the professor just began to lecture. He was going through his slides. There was actually some issues that he was having with his slides, but he kept kind of working his way through. And at the end of the lecture, he asked the half of the class that had eaten as much as they wanted, do you notice anything weird about the slides? And many of them just kind of said, it seems like they were glitching or something. But when he turned to the half of the class that, had gone without food for 24 hours, many of them said, every time you would change slides or every few slides when you transitioned, there was a very quick picture of like a hamburger or a juicy steak or, something that was really appetizing. And they were able to pick up on that a little bit more than someone who didn't already have this primed feeling of hunger. Right? So that changed their conscious experience, right? Other really fascinating things, when it comes to this altered states of consciousness has to do with things like daydreaming, right? Daydreaming is such a fascinating concept because we're essentially creating a reality within our own mind. It's not something we're actually physically experiencing. But like my favorite thing to daydream is when I'm in the shower, I'm having an argument with that person, and I'm thinking about, oh, this is what I'd say, and so that, you kind of have this like internal glory about how you bested this person or that, and really it was just a daydream. It was just something I kind of created, a figment of my imagination, if you will. Other really fascinating things when it comes to the exploration of our conscious experience is the idea of not only deprivation of things like food or water, but just sensory deprivation. When we don't have a lot of input from our sensory organs, right? Like in cases where like they were exploring what it would be like to be in outer space, and so NASA, as part of their exploration of that concept, had astronauts in preparation do a sensory deprivation experiment. And part of the sensory deprivation experiment is they actually would place them in this large tank of water, and when they were in the large tank of water, they'd cover the top so it was completely pitch black. And so not only did they not have anything they could see, but they were virtually weightless in the water. And with their big suits on, right, they didn't have a lot of sensation of feeling or touch, right, as things like the giant gloves and the giant suit kind of impaired that. And there wasn't any sound coming through, right? They're in a giant tank of water in the middle of it, right? And so as a result, really fascinating things started happening, right? In fact, a few of the participants actually began to hallucinate, to see or hear things that they didn't see or hear, right? Their brain didn't have any sensory organ input. And as a result, right, their brain started fabricating. Their brain started like looking for any sort of sensory input, and at times just the slightest bit of activation across the brain created a different conscious awareness. Incredible. We're not going to spend very much time on the concept of hypnosis, and I know they shift these things around in the chapters a little bit, but what I do want to say about that is that hypnosis is probably not this this incredible magical experience like you might have seen in TV, where you can just kind of go back and revisit all your old memories and even bring in extra details, things you never noticed in the first place. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the chapter of memory. But what I do want to say about it is that when we're in a hypnotic state, we're essentially in a suggestive state. We're in a heavily relaxed sensation, and we are more open to suggestion. Here's a fun idea. Have you ever been, let's say, driving to work and realized that for the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes, you completely were thinking about something else? You don't even remember driving to work. How did that happen? What was going on? Did you not have any memory, or did you not observe the road that you're driving on? What we're looking at here is the fascinating dual track of the mind, right? Where we have certain experiences and certain things that we do that take a lot of specific thinking, willful thinking power, right? Where we're choosing to attend to certain bits of information, right? And then we have these other parts of our conscious experience that, because they're so routine, because we've done these things over and over again, that we almost habitually perform these things without having to spend a lot of this cognitive energy, a lot of this thought process, right? It is like an algorithm or routine. We just follow it and it gets us the results each time. So our mind is able to go elsewhere, or able to have this higher road of conscious awareness in another thing, while having this lower road of conscious awareness that allows us to perform those simple tasks. Now, this gets us into a really interesting area, right? If we think about the video that I showed us in the very first class, the one where they had the amazing color-changing card trick, right? And most people didn't pick up on all the changes that happened in the video, the change of the tablecloth, the change of the background, the change of the shirts, right? Most people weren't picking that up. And it's not because our eyes weren't picking up those colors, right? Because we were seeing the video, we were seeing what's happening, but we weren't consciously aware of the changes. And this idea, this very concept, is called selective inattention, right? Selective inattention, or things like inattentional blindness or changed blindness, right? These things happen because we have that high and low road of our conscious awareness, and we chose to selectively attune our attention, spotlight, if you will, our attention to this area, and these things around the periphery kind of became unimportant, or at least unimportant to our conscious awareness in that moment. to really make the case of the differences between the high and low road of consciousness, let's talk about the case where this woman came into the hospital and was found to have some brain damage. However, the area of damage to the brain was different than the area where she receives her optical information. Right? So in other words, there's no damage to the eye or the retina or any of that part. However, what we found is that she had some capabilities of performing certain tasks while not necessarily being able to have a conscious experience of it. Right? So for example, they would look at kind of a task like, can you describe this picture? Can you tell me what you see here? And she had no ability to tell someone what she was able to see. However, when asked to do something like, here, take this letter, take this piece of mail, and I want you to put it in this mail slot, in a mail slot that was very thin, I mean, just big enough to put that piece of mail in, and she could do that without having to try. It seemed like she knew exactly where it was going. Or when they would have her walk down a hallway and put barriers in her way, just like little objects here and there, she seemed to just kind of navigate her way around these objects. But when asked, she had no conscious awareness of what objects were in her way, or even that there was one. She just simply kind of was moving. And again, this is starting to show us a little bit of the difference between the high road of consciousness, is what we call the visual perception track, right? The way we perceive information coming from the outside world, versus the low road of consciousness, which is our visual action track. Right? This is the part that performs those behaviors, those routines, those things that we've done over and over again, right? Without having to have a high road of conscious experience. So this gets us into the concept of selective attention, right? Because we know that our conscious experience is about our ability to attend to our environment, to certain situations, right? So again, I kind of mentioned before, it's kind of like the flashlight of attention. We can choose to shine that flashlight in certain areas, right? And what that means is, because we're so focused, we're so pushed to kind of fixate on that information, it seems like all the other areas are still in the dark, right? We're not able to see those areas because that's not where the flashlight of our attention is focused, right? And in the most part, that seems to make sense, right? That seems to be kind of how our conscious experience works. But when we look at situations like when you're at a party, or you're at a really bustling event and there are lots of people there and you're trying to talk to someone, let's say a friend, and you're trying to tell them a story, but it's so loud you're really having to pay attention to what they're saying, right? Are you listening to every other person's conversation? No, right? You're focused on what you're trying to hear, right? But what is fascinating is that if someone, let's say 20 feet away, starts talking and they say your name, all of a sudden you go, wait, someone just said my name. Wait a second. We just got done saying that we're not listening to every single conversation, right? We're not going through and trying to hear what every person in the room is saying, but there is still something happening, right? This other road of consciousness, that essentially that low road of consciousness, is still processing all that information. It's still taking in so many pieces and filtering these through to things that we're familiar with, things that are concerning to us, things that may mean that we may be in danger, or that someone is trying to essentially get our attention, right? And so again, it's just fascinating to see kind of the differences we find here. All right, so let's shift gears for a moment. So far, we've been talking about this concept of selective attention, right? But when we're shifting gears here, I want to talk about the idea of sleep and how that kind of conscious experience differs. When we think about sleep, I think we often just assume that we don't have a conscious experience of that time. But if we look at the little pieces of sleep, things like our dreams, things like the fact that we don't just accidentally roll out of bed every day, unless we have a specific sleeping disorder. But for the most part, we have some conscious awareness of things like our position in the bed, our kind of relative, like if we're sitting in a rocking chair, we can kind of feel that motion even if we're asleep. So that tells us that we still have some type of conscious awareness even when we're asleep. And so some psychologists talk about that as like the window of consciousness, as opposed to the big gaping doorway that we have when we're awake. The way that sleep works, we don't just think about the time when we're actually eyes closed and sleeping. We also think about the rhythm that we go throughout our day as we prepare for sleep, and then as we arise for the next day. We see that the circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle that kind of follows not only our sleep, but as well what our waking hours look like and how our body prepares to fall asleep and how it prepares to awake the next day. We also see that these cycles that we go through are so important because when we have a shift in it, like let's say we travel to a different time zone, it seems like we have a difficulty shifting to the new time. And that's because, again, our body has been set up with this biological clock to say, hey, this is about the time when we should be getting tired. It's preparing us like it does every day. And when we are out of routine, it seems like our circadian rhythm is completely out of routine as well. We also see that the peak hours, the hours where we have the most kind of focus and attentional capacity, seem to come at different times for different ages. But more specifically, we see that the older we get, it seems like the peak attention time frame is early in the morning. But especially if we're kind of in our kind of late teenage years and even through our late 20s, we even see that our attentional capacity seems to be more geared at nighttime, or the night owls, if you will. We also see that sleep is not stagnant. It is not just like we're conscious and then asleep and that's all that happens. Like we go through these stages of sleep, essentially kind of going from very light sleep to slightly deeper and deeper and deeper sleep. And then we hit this really weird stage called the REM sleep, right? This rapid eye movement sleep. And there are different things that happen in these different stages. Stage 1 is a very light sleep, like I said before, and we start to see a little bit of muscle twitching and activity, and we even see a slight reduction in things like our breathing. Now, getting into stage 2, that's where we start to see a much greater reduction in our breathing patterns, our heart rate starts to slow down, and we also have a decrease in our body temperature. Stage 3 is where we really get into some deep sleep. Now, what's really interesting, if you look at the slide on the stages of sleep, you can actually watch the brainwave patterns change, right? Before, these are very tight brainwave patterns. They're kind of going up and down really fast, right? But especially as we get into stage 3, you'll start to see these kind of much more jagged and kind of slowed brainwave patterns. And then you get into stage 4 sleep, and it's a very deep sleep, and we see these huge arcing kind of up and down, very slow, not very condensed, kind of wide apart curves, right? And that shows us that our brain activity has really changed, and we're in this kind of whole different state of sleep. Now, it's after this that we get into what we call the REM sleep. Now, what's really fascinating about REM sleep is that when we look at the way that our brain is active kind of in the other stages of sleep, REM sleep is different because it actually looks very much like when we're awake, right? In fact, some researchers have been able to show that when we're, for example, performing a new task, when we're in our waking hours, let's say learning how to do a puzzle, what we see is that in that sleep, when we kind of get into REM, the brainwave patterns are almost identical to when we're awake. So what's happening? What we see is that REM sleep is the only stage of sleep where we actually have the capacity to dream. Okay? And so dreaming and the content that comes with dreaming may have a connection with what we were working on learning during the day. Right? Isn't that a fascinating idea that we could literally be working on that puzzle that we started with during the day while we sleep, right? We're almost having this kind of reflection or review of information during that time. Now, the shift between being awake and hitting that stage 1 sleep is so quick that most of us have no conscious awareness of the experience. You look at studies where people have actually kind of evaluated someone's ability to be consciously aware. There have been many times that we've proven that people are not able to actually show proof that they know that they fell asleep. In one study, they had participants' eyes taped open, right, so that they wouldn't fall asleep. They had them go through a period of time where they didn't sleep, about 24 hours, and then they had them lay in a bed, and what they did is they gave them a clicker, and they had a light that above them that would flash on and off real quick, and their job was to press the button every time that light flashed. And we'd see them kind of pushing the button consistently with the light above them, and then all of a sudden they would miss 1 or 2 or 3 button pushes, and then the light would flash and they'd start pressing again. You say, okay, so what happened? Say, what do you mean? They're like, you missed pressing the button. I'd say, no, I didn't. I pressed it every time. I was focused. I was watching. And so what we showed there is that that person slid into that stage 1 sleep and came right back out of it without any conscious experience, right? Again, so fascinating, so interesting to see how quick those stages go together. Another really fascinating phenomena that happens in those in-between stages between right before we fall asleep and that moment we fall asleep is we can actually have a weird experience called a hypnagogic hallucination. Right? In other words, where as our brain activity is starting to slow and we kind of keep spiking up for a minute to try to maintain our conscious awareness, we will actually have areas of the brain activate that don't need to. And so we'll all of a sudden hear like, oh, was that a loud noise? Or all of a sudden feel like we saw something just pass by real quickly because, again, our brain activity is trying to slow and we have these sudden kind of shifts, these sudden electrical currents that are flowing through our mind, and that creates these little hallucinatory experiences. REM sleep was actually discovered somewhat by accident. Which is really interesting. When we look at kind of the way that we evaluate the stages of sleep, we use a machine called an EEG machine, right? And the idea is that it kind of monitors the brainwave activation, right? And so this person named Eugene Azarinsky was actually repairing a faulty EEG machine, and after repairing it, he tried it on his own children, making sure the product works. And when he had it on his own child, he kept going, I'm having this malfunction, right? The brain waves are looking a certain way. We get into those delta waves, and all of a sudden we're back to these really kind of rapid movement waves. And obviously he could see that his child was asleep. But then he started realizing, wait a second, this isn't an error. This is a different type of sleep. This is that type of sleep where all of a sudden things shift up. We even have things like our respiration and our heart rate will start to almost increase during that stage. Now, what's really fascinating and interesting is that when we hit this stage of sleep, we actually have kind of this this change in our motor cortex, right? There's actually a hormone that's released to prevent our body from mobilizing, right? Because we don't need to be reacting to our dreams. And so you actually have this sleep paralysis, this hormone that actually prevents or blocks the brainstem from creating movement in your body. Now, if you wake someone up at the very moment that kind of sleep paralysis sets in, you can actually have this very short period of what's called paradoxical sleep. And paradoxical sleep is basically where we're consciously awake, but the body is not able to move. We're still paralyzed due to that hormone release, and then moments later we regain it. And you can imagine this is scary, right? If someone wakes up in this kind of sleep paralysis, it feels like something is holding them down. It feels like they have this sudden incapability. And so when you hear about stories like people having moments where they feel like they woke up and like I felt like something was holding me down, like a ghost or something like that, that's pretty much what we're looking at, right? That's this paradoxical sleep that they just ran into. We see that our biology and our age also has an impact on how much sleep and when we sleep, right? Specifically, if you look at our kind of biological makeup or the things that we kind of inherit from our previous lineage, we find that the amount of sleep that our predecessors needed to feel adequate, whether it was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that is almost the same amount of sleep that we also need, right? So it seems to be varied based on kind of familial links, right? So the optimal level of sleep you hear is like 8, which, is a pretty good measure, but it could be plus or minus 2 or 3. Right? It could be most people, certain people that, them and their families kind of need about 6 hours of sleep and they're golden. And then there are those who need almost 9 hours of sleep or more to really feel that they're fully rested. Age plays a role because we see that especially in our younger years, the very beginning of our development as infants, we actually require a lot more sleep. We're taking in a lot more information. And because we're constantly taking in more information, we're needing to kind of have these moments where we're reflecting, we're reconnecting with that information. And once as we get older, we notice we do require a little bit less. So as a baby or an infant, we might require up to like 16 hours of sleep to kind of really take in all of the information. But as we get older, it seems like we need a little bit less and less. Other things that can impact sleep are things like our environment. If we're in an environment that's very bright and has a lot of artificial light or reflected light coming directly to our retinas, it actually kind of prevents the release of our body's natural melatonin to release so that we can start to feel sleepy, right? Because it sees the light and says, oh, it must still be daytime. Right? And so being able to have a little bit less light can actually help to induce sleep a little bit faster because the body's not picking up on artificial or incorrect light cues. Why do we sleep? Well, one of the big things we find out is that it is very kind of survivalistic, right? We sleep at night mainly because we have poor visual acuity, right? But we also see that part of our sleep pattern is also the healing part of our bodies, right? Our bodies actually go through kind of a healing process, kind of allowing us to kind of really spend more energy there than in other areas. We also see that sleep is also the only time when growth hormones are released. So especially those teenagers, they need to sleep more. It's because that's the only time those growth hormones can come out and kind of really be released. And so that's why you see sleep becomes a lot more important during some of those developmental years. As well as we see that sleep also helps to strengthen memories.